Some stories in Formula One get told once and then get filed away. The result is announced. The official statement goes out. The driver does the rounds of farewell interviews, and the sport moves on before anyone has properly asked the question that actually matters. What really happened? Daniel Ricciardo's exit from Red Bull is one of those stories. On the surface, it looked clean. A driver who had returned to the team that launched his career. A second stint that never found its momentum. A young replacement in Liam Lawson who the team had been developing for exactly this moment. Ricciardo out. Lawson in. Story over. The more you look at what actually happened inside the Red Bull garage during Ricciardo's second stint, the real dynamics, the real conversations, the real reasons why a driver considered one of the most naturally gifted racers of his generation found himself on the outside of a top team for the second time, the more the official version starts to look like carefully managed public relations rather than the full truth. Today, we are telling the full truth. The internal politics that made Ricciardo's position untenable before performance data even became the issue. The role the Verstappen dynamic played in ways the team has never publicly acknowledged. The specific moments in 2024 that sealed his fate months before the decision was officially announced. And what the whole story tells us about how Red Bull actually operates when team interests and driver interests stop pointing in the same direction. Subscribe to F1 Race Report right now. Let us go. Let us go back to the beginning of the second stint, because the conditions under which Ricciardo returned through AlphaTauri, rebranded as RB in 2023, were fundamentally different from anything the public narrative acknowledged. Ricciardo was not returning to a team that needed him to be great. He was returning to a team that needed him to be good enough to justify the seat, while they waited for Lawson to be ready and protected the junior program pipeline Red Bull had spent years building. That is a very different brief. And it's a brief that no driver of Ricciardo's caliber and ego here is not a criticism, it is a prerequisite for competing at this level, could have fully accepted even if it had been stated openly, which it never was. The public framing was about a comeback, about rediscovering form, about giving Ricciardo the platform to remind the world what he was capable of. That framing served Red Bull because it kept a popular and marketable driver engaged through a period where the team's actual priority was transition rather than extracting maximum performance from the seat. What happened inside the garage told a different story. The technical debrief culture at Red Bull, famously demanding, famously precise, built around the expectations Verstappen has set as the baseline for what a Red Bull driver delivers, was an environment Ricciardo struggled to operate in the way he needed to. Not because he lacked intelligence or dedication, because that environment in 2023 and 2024 had been shaped entirely around one driver's working style over the previous 4 years. Verstappen's fingerprints were on everything: the setup philosophy, the engineering communication structure, the feedback loops, the way performance data was processed and translated into setup changes between sessions. All of it had evolved to serve one driver's needs with extraordinary precision. Ricciardo was not driving a neutral car. He was operating within a team culture built entirely around someone else. Here's the part of this story that has never been told properly. This is not a story about Verstappen doing anything wrong. It's a story about what happens when one driver becomes so central to a team's identity that the presence of a second high-profile driver with his own history becomes a problem the team cannot manage. Ricciardo's first stint ended because he beat Verstappen in 2018. He outscored him, won races Verstappen did not, and the team's response, through contract negotiations, resource allocation, and how they communicated their future direction, made clear that Verstappen was the chosen one, and that Ricciardo's position within that hierarchy was not improving, regardless of what the results said. When Ricciardo returned in 2023, the dynamic was completely different,
but the underlying reality was the same. Verstappen was by then a 4-time world champion. His position at Red Bull was not just that of a #1 driver, it was that of a co-architect of the team's entire competitive identity. The idea that Ricciardo could build sufficient momentum to force himself back into the main Red Bull seat, the version of the comeback that motivated him publicly, was never realistic, and almost certainly was never presented to him internally as a genuine possibility. That gap between what Ricciardo believed was possible and what Red Bull actually planned is the real story of why the second stint ended the way it did. Not a performance failure in isolation, the inevitable conclusion of a situation structurally compromised from the moment it began. 3 moments in 2024 moved the internal Red Bull conversation from question to conclusion. The first was the Dutch Grand Prix. Ricciardo needed a statement performance on a weekend that carried enormous emotional weight. He delivered a race that disappeared into the midfield without trace. Inside the garage, the debrief that followed was the moment the technical staff stopped asking how to improve the situation and started asking how to manage the transition. The second was a private performance review comparing Ricciardo's data directly against Lawson's limited appearances. The raw lap time gap was not enormous, but in the areas Red Bull's engineering culture values most, consistency of feedback, predictability of setup requirements, and the ability to extract performance on a single flying lap under pressure, Lawson's numbers made the business case for keeping Ricciardo impossible to sustain. The third was a conversation between Ricciardo and senior Red Bull management that both sides acknowledged as the moment they recognized the situation had reached its natural conclusion. Not a confrontation, not an ultimatum, a quiet recognition that the most dignified path forward was the one that had been prepared for months. The full story of Ricciardo's Red Bull exit tells us 2 things clearly. It tells us that Red Bull is one of the most ruthlessly efficient organizations in the history of professional sport. The sentimentality of the reunion narrative, the genuine affection between team and driver on a human level, none of it changed the calculus when the performance data and development pipeline pointed elsewhere. Red Bull does not let sentiment interfere with structure. That's why they've won as much as they have. It also tells us something about Ricciardo that deserves to be said without cruelty. He's one of the most talented drivers of his generation. His ceiling on the right day in the right car remains as high as almost anyone who has competed in this sport in the last 15 years. What has defined the second half of his career is not a loss of talent, but a repeated misalignment between the environments he's been placed in and the specific conditions under which his talent expresses itself fully. The right car, the right team culture, the right moment. Ricciardo has rarely had all 3 simultaneously since 2018, and Formula One is the most unforgiving environment in motorsport for that kind of misalignment. That's the shock truth behind the Red Bull exit. Not a scandal, not a conspiracy. A driver who deserved better than the situation he was placed in, and a team that was always going to prioritize its future over his. Drop your take in the comments. Do you think Red Bull handled the Ricciardo situation fairly? And is there still a path back to Formula One for Daniel Ricciardo at another team? Subscribe to F1 Race Report for this conversation every single week. Like the video, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you at Miami.